večer, vážené divačky, vážení diváci, vítám vás u přenosu výroční přednášky Liberálního institutu 2020. Já jsem Martin Pánek, ředitel Liberálního institutu, je mojí milostí vás dnes večer na tomto přenosu přivítat. Liberální institut je český think tank, který byl založen v roce 1989 a výroční přednášky pořádá od roku 1995. Prvním laureátem byl americký nobelista Gary Becker v roce 1995, jak jsem řekl, a posledním laureátem v roce 2019 byl americký filozof Tom Palmer. Letos se jedná o 24. výroční přednášku. Jejím laureátem letošní výroční ceny je David Friedman, americký ekonom, právní teoretik, fyzik a teoretik anarchokapitalismu. Tématem jeho přednášky budou soukromé a decentralizované právní systémy a my musíme tuto přednášku dělat takto online kvůli koronaviru samozřejmě. Měli jsme tady Davida Friedmana přivítat už na jaře fyzicky v Praze, ale bohužel to nebylo možné, museli jsme to na poslední chvíli zrušit. David Friedman je autorem několika knih, jednou z nich je například Mechanismus svobody, který se v angličtině jmenuje Machinery of Freedom Guide to Radical Capitalism. Bohužel ještě nebyla tato kniha přeložena do češtiny, ale třeba se někdy v blízké době dočkáme. Jeho poslední kniha z roku 2019 má název Právní systémy velmi odlišné od těch našich, Legal Systems Very Different from Our Own a From Ours, a je také autorem 3 románů, Harald, Salamander a Brothers. Je velkým fanouškem počítačových, ale nejen počítačových her, science fiction, fantasy a je dlouholetým členem společnosti kreativního anachronismu, která se zabývá studiem středověku. Friedmanovým klasickým textem je Private Creation and Enforcement of Law, a Historical Case, který tento paper se zabývá Islandem a právním systémem na Islandu mezi 10. a 13. stoletím. Je synem Miltona a Rose Friedmanových, autorů knihy Svoboda volby, kterou jsme letos podruhé vydali v Liberálním institutu a kterou si můžete koupit na našem e-shopu. A je otcem Patrika Friedmana, který se zabývá seasteadingem. Jeho otec měl výroční přednášku Liberálního institutu a stal se laureátem výroční ceny v roce 1997. Jaký bude program té dnešní přednášky? Po mém stručném úvodu předám slovo panu Davidu Friedmanovi, který bude mluvit tak 40 až 60 minut a promluví, jak už jsem říkal, o soukromých a decentralizovaných právních systémech. A potom bude následovat část pro vaše dotazy, které nám můžete pokládat pod streamem na Facebooku nebo pod streamem na YouTube, po případě klidně na Twitteru nebo do e-mailu, pokud chcete. Já si to budu pokoušet sledovat a vaše otázky rád předám do Kalifornie, odkud vysílá pan profesor Friedman. Můžete taky sledovat, když je záběr na mě, tak můžete sledovat cenu Bitcoinu. Pokud by vás zaujal CryptoClock, tak je k dispozici na Open Bazaru. A já už teda předám slovo panu Friedmanovi. It's my great pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Friedman, and his speech today, as I said, will be on private and decentralized legal systems. Sorry. Is everything okay?
Everything is fine. It's a little complicated. One of them. Can you see my PowerPoints? Yes. Very good. All right. My subject today is law without the state, past, present, and future. The past, what I will be discussing is what I call feud law, which is a form of private law enforcement that has existed in quite a number of societies in the past. In fact, I've argued that many and perhaps most existing legal systems are in some sense built on top of pre-existing feud law systems. My most recent book, Legal Systems Very Different, includes a chapter on feud law and several chapters describing societies that worked that way, as well as many other societies. I then want to go on to talk about forms of competitive private law that exist at present or in the near future, with two different categories. One of them is private law that exists in real space. And the examples I'm going to be giving of that are seasteading and embedded cities mainly. And then the possibilities for some sort of a private law in cyberspace, what's sometimes referred to as crypto anarchy. And then I will finally discuss what was part of the subject of my first book, Anarchokapitalism, in which I'm imagining what a fully private competitive legal system might plausibly look like. So let me start with feud law. And the basic logic of feud law is very simple. It is that if you wrong me, I will harm you unless you compensate me for the wrong. And that's a simple set of rules, and the question is, how do you make it into a workable legal system? And to do so, you have to solve four different problems. First, you need some way of making it a system of law, not of extortion. You don't want a situation where I can pretend you wronged me and make you pay me off to not harm you and get away with it. So you need some mechanism that, as I like to put it, right makes might, so that being in the right makes it much easier to succeed in what you're doing than being in the wrong. You need some kind of a commitment mechanism, some reason why I will actually carry out my threat if you don't compensate me, instead of backing down when you, of course, respond that if I harm you, you'll harm me. And you need a commitment mechanism that works past death, because otherwise your obvious solution when I say you just did something bad to me and so I'm going to harm you if you don't compensate me is to do one more bad thing, namely killing me, and then it's finished. So you need a solution to that problem. You need some way of protecting the rights of people who don't have the resources to use force themselves to make believable threats. And you need a way of terminating feuds. Real legal systems show solutions to all four of these problems. Let me start with right makes might. You need a reason why my threat is believable if you wronged me and not if you didn't. In Saga period Iceland, which is the first such system that I came across and wrote about many years ago, and then have an updated version in the new book where the chapter there corrects a few mistakes and adds additional material from my old article. And in
Mr. Friedman?
For some reason, the PowerPoint does not seem to have updated.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Yes, I do not know what is happening. Let me go back to, I'm supposed to be still presenting, so I don't know why this is not happening, but it is happening. So I was on the previous you're just still at the beginning. If necessary, I can give the talk without the PowerPoints. I used to do that for a long time. But can you figure out a way of making the system work?
Can you perhaps end the presentation on Meet and start anew? I'm not sure why it's not updating.
I will stop presenting. I will present now in a window, and I will select the appropriate window. All right, it's now showing that, and let's see if it shows the next one. Well, actually, let me finish doing this one first. You need, in Saga period Iceland, there was a legislature and a court system, so it was a single legal system, but there was no executive arm of government. Enforcement was entirely private. If I sue you in that legal system, and it was in effect tort law swallowing criminal law, because I could be suing you for killing my son, for example. If I sue you and win, and you don't pay the damages that the court has assessed, you get outlawed. Once you are outlawed, it is legal to kill you, illegal for anybody to defend you. So in that system, you have, that's one example of what many of these systems have in different forms, which is essentially reputational enforcement. Some mechanisms so that people not involved in the conflict know who the bad guy is, and therefore are likely to ally with the person who's in the right and not with the person who's in the wrong, because, to put it simply, extortionists are undesirable neighbors. So if I'm pretending to have a claim against you and I don't, and everybody knows it, I don't get help, you do. That's a very much simplified version. Read the book for more details. You need commitment mechanisms. You need some way of making me carry out my threat. And we start with the commitment mechanism that is hardwired into human beings, and that's vengefulness. The fact that when someone has wronged you, you want to get him. We observe that in animals in the form of territorial behavior. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but if anybody tells you that property rights are a creation of the state, you should observe that a primitive form of property rights pre-exists not only the state, but our species. That there are quite a lot of territorial species of animals where a bird or a fish, or sometimes a mammal, marks the territory he is claiming and then somehow flips a switch in his brain so that if another member of the species trespasses, he will fight more and more desperately against the trespasser. And since a fight to the death is usually a loss to both sides, that results in trespassers usually backing off. So that's a non-human example of a commitment mechanism. And the human one, you can see in your own emotions. I observe that if I stand up and bump my head, I feel angry. There's nobody to be angry at. It wasn't the fault of the thing I bumped into, but I am designed to react that way. And that is the beginning of a commitment strategy. There are others for humans. We're fancier than fish or birds. If I back down after making my threat, I'm marking myself as a target, which puts me at risk of other people violating my rights and concluding they can get away with it. I want the reputation of somebody who you shouldn't wrong. Furthermore, humans care a lot about status. If I make a threat and back down, I look like a wimp, and who wants to be seen as a wimp? How do I enforce my commitment past death? In something like the Icelandic system, you kill me, that establishes a claim against you for, I think, 200 ounces of silver and outlawry. So my kin inherit that claim, and it's in their interest to act to enforce that claim, both because they want the money and they want to establish that killing their kin is expensive. So that's a set of commitment mechanisms. How do we protect the weak? And again, my best example is Iceland. That's the one I know best. In Iceland, tort claims are marketable. You can transfer your claim for damages to somebody else. I like to argue that in this respect, modern American law is a mere 1,000 years behind the cutting edge of legal technology. There are arguments for doing that in our system, which I won't get into here. I've discussed them in print. Imagine I'm someone who is poor and elderly, and my only son is killed. And I know that although I have a legal right to collect 200 ounces of silver, if I actually try to go to court, I'll be beaten up on the way by the bad guys, whoever killed him. And if I did succeed in winning my case and get somebody outlawed, I wouldn't have the ability to go kill him, even though it's legal to kill him. However, there is a solution to this problem. My neighbor has 4 strong sons who went a Viking when they were a youth. That's one of the ways in which young Icelanders see the world. He has kin, he has friends, he's a strong guy in this system. So what do? I transfer my claim for 200 ounces of silver to him. He sues, collects. Maybe he gives me some of it, maybe he doesn't, depending on the terms of our agreement and how hard it was for him to collect. But the critical thing is that the person who killed my son ends up paying, possibly being outlawed, and that makes it expensive to violate the rights of the rights even of the weak. So that's the way that system worked. Somalia, which is my other standard example, Somaliland, northern Somalia, which was a functioning stateless society, somewhat like Iceland, but not very much like Iceland for a long time, before the establishment of the country of Somalia, which was imposed by the English and the Italians on a stateless society and turned out rather badly. In Somalia, you have a pre-existing coalition that everybody's a member of one such coalition. It's formed in part by kinship and in part by explicit contract, and the other members of that coalition have rights with regard to your claims, which make it in their interest to do something about it. Again, for details, see my Legal Systems Very Different book, my most recent book, not my earliest book. How do you terminate feud? The situation that we are worried about is a situation in which you think I wronged you, I think I didn't. You demand compensation, I refuse. You harm me, now I think I was wrong, so I demand compensation. Both of us are stuck in this. This is what people imagine feuds to be like, although it turns out it's not a very common pattern, because either of us who backs down looks like a wimp. One solution in both Iceland and Somalia is to have a court verdict. In Iceland, the court system is set up in advance, as it were. You have the courts, well, the higher level courts meet once a year. In Somalia, there are mechanisms for creating, as it were, an ad hoc court for a particular dispute. Another solution is an arbitrator. The feuding parties want a way out of this feud, so they agree on somebody powerful and respected who will arbitrate the dispute and say who's in the wrong, who owes whom what, promise to accept his ruling. If I rule against him, again, if he rules against me and I don't accept the ruling, if he rules against me and I do accept the ruling, I don't look like a wimp because I had agreed in advance. It's not a reason why somebody else can violate my rights because they can't expect an arbitrator to agree with them. And if I don't accept it, we've now added one powerful player to the coalition against me since he's going to be offended at my breaking my agreement. So that's a mechanism for terminating feuds, seems to work tolerably well. What does this tell us? It does not tell us whether a feud system is better than a modern legal system, but it does demonstrate that it is possible for private institutions to replace government in its most central function, which is law enforcement. And I've given two examples, but it looks to me as though versions of this are actually historically very common. That in my first book, I sketched out an imaginary fully private legal system. That was Machinery of Freedom, where I was describing my version of anarchokapitalism. And when I did the research that led to my current book, my most recent book, I discovered that in my first book, I had been reinventing the wheel. That what I was describing was a modern, developed society, high division of labor version of what has existed in primitive form in the past. Let me now go on to the present. And I'm going to discuss separately private law in real space and private law in cyberspace, and I'll start with real space. And there is one form of private law that we are all familiar with but don't usually think about, and that's private norms. It would be entirely legal, back when I was a professor, I've retired a few years ago, for me to teach a class naked to the waist. Might even be legal to do it in my underpants, I'm not sure. It would, however, have been a very foolish thing to do because people would have concluded I was a weirdo. It would have been harder for me to get speaking engagements, except for people who really liked looking at half-naked professors, which probably would not be interesting audiences. It might be harder for me to make friends with my colleagues. I would lose all sorts of reputation and status as a result. That's a very common system, even though we don't usually call it law. There's a very interesting book called Order Without Law by Robert Ellickson, who's a Yale law professor. And he describes a system of private norms an hour or two from where I live in a rural county in California, where for certain legal issues, the norms trump the law of California. And the reason they do that is that if I'm in the wrong according to the norms, but in the right according to the law, and I sue you in order to get the law on my side, suing your neighbors is a violation of the norms of neighborly behavior. So I will lose more by being seen by everybody around me as a bad neighbor than I'll win by gaining the case. Consequently, in effect, for certain issues, not for all issues, the norms are more powerful than the law. It's a very interesting book. I recommend it. There are, in modern societies, traditional embedded legal systems. What I mean by an embedded legal system is a group of people who succeed in enforcing their own rules on their own members, even though they are under the rule of a state legal system. And the two modern examples, which I discuss in some detail in the book, are the Amish and the Romani, sometimes called gypsies. And the Amish succeed in enforcing their legal system because the means they use to enforce it involve punishments that don't violate any ordinary law. And the Romani do it very largely by staying below the radar, by following policies that make them largely invisible to the official legal system. That's breaking down at present, I think, as technology makes it harder to do that. And then I want to go on to talk about modern competitive systems. First, the ones that exist among governments, for example, corporate law, which is in some senses a competitive market for law, even though the law is made by governments, but then more interestingly, among private substitutes for governments, as it were, non-Amish equivalents of their system. One of those is seasteading, which can happen either as an embedded or as a not embedded system, depending on whether it's in territorial waters or on the high seas. And finally, embedded cities, which is something that's been developing recently and looks like an interesting potential way of ending up with most people under essentially private law, even if within the boundaries of the country. Let me say a little more about the Amish, because it occurred to me when I was working on this talk that the Amish are an existing example of the pattern that I expect to be developing in the future for the rest of us. Each congregation of Amish, the Amish, by the way, is, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, are a religious group. They're a form of Anabaptists. They originated in, I think, Germany and Switzerland, if I remember correctly, eventually migrated to the US. I think at this point, all of the Amish are in the US. There may still be a few in Canada, but nowhere else. Each congregation of the Amish has an ordnung, a set of legal rules, largely rules about what technologies you can use, because the Amish restrict what technologies their members are allowed to use for reasons that I'm not going to go into now, but can discuss if people are curious. And the ultimate threat is ostracism. Maidung is their term for it. And what that means is that other members of your congregation, and probably of other congregations, will be reluctant to have much to do with you. The legal rules are changed by unanimous consent in most Amish congregations. Congregation is only 25 to 40 families. And the reason for that is the Amish don't build churches or meeting houses, so the entire congregation has to be able to fit in a barn or a large house. An Amish family can choose which congregation to be a member of. There are some Amish settlements where you have, in effect, overlapping geographical territories. So there are some places where someone who is unhappy with the ordnung of his congregation can switch to a different congregation without actually physically moving. There are other places where in order as a practical matter to switch which congregation he's in, he's got to sell the farm he's got, buy somebody else's farm somewhere nearby, and move. So what that means is that the Amish have, in effect, a competitive legal system. In the extreme case, even without moving, you're choosing which set of rules to be under, and it's embedded within a state legal system. Let me now go on to my elder son's Patri's project, which is an interesting one, of which my view is that it probably won't work, but would be great if it did. And it's making some progress at this point. I haven't followed it in much detail, and he wasn't answering his phone when I called him yesterday to try to get updates on it, so I can't give you any very recent information. But the basic idea of seasteading is that you have polities of floating housing. Floating housing could consist of boats, even an old cruise ship you could buy. The original idea is you develop a technology for giant rafts with houses on them. And you can imagine other ways it could be done. But the basic idea is places people can live that are on the ocean and can be moved around. And in one version of the idea, they are located in the territorial waters of a state, in which case they are a modern version of an embedded legal system, sort of like the Amish in that respect. However, unlike the Amish, they can choose which state to be in. Since these are mobile people, they've got the potential, if the state that they are in the territorial waters of doesn't let them do things the way they want, they can find another state that seems more willing to invite them and move their whole polity to somebody else's territorial waters. And you can imagine doing a seasteading on the high seas where they're fully stateless. I suppose they might or might not want a flag of convenience from some state somewhere, but they would be completely in control of themselves. But of course, they also have to worry about pirates and problems of that sort. Think about a collection of seasteads located next to each other as a town. That town will have its own legal rules. It'll have some way of enforcing those laws. It'll have some set of political institutions. It could be a dictatorship. It could be one individual who says, if you join this seastead, I get to make the rules. It could be a democracy. It could be anything else. I like to say that the best political system I know of is competitive dictatorship, which is the way that hotels and restaurants are run. The restaurant I go to, I have no vote at all on what's on the menu, but an absolute vote on whether I go to that restaurant. But democracy has also got its advantages. You've got some sunk costs, as it were, in getting along with your neighbors, so you may want to have some control over the rules. Note that towns are competing for citizens since everybody is movable. So if you don't like the rules of your town, you don't have to have a political movement or run an election. You can just call a tugboat, get tugged over, or if you're in a ship, sail over to a different town. Or if none of them fit the rules you want, you can find other people who have the same desires as you do and create your own town. So it's in some sense a very attractive idea for a society in which law was, as it were, fully competitive. I want to go on to a newer, at least for me, newer development. There's actually versions of it have been around for quite a while. And that's what I've started to think of as embedded cities. And what do? You get a country to create a territory with its own law, not the country's law. Typically, that includes civil law, contract law, that sort of stuff. In most cases, you're still under the criminal law of the country. And a very large example of that is one which played quite a large role in what's happened, were the special economic zones in China. That what happened was that after Mao died, the Chinese elite were able to go abroad, and they discovered to their astonishment that although they had what they thought was the world's best economic system, socialism, they're also one of the poorest countries in the world. So they said, well, socialism may be right, but we're doing something wrong. Let's figure out what the capitalists do that's so clever, and then we can imitate it. So they set up special economic zones, which were territories within which you could play by the capitalist rules of the game. They set them up in places that didn't matter very much, so if something went wrong, it wouldn't be important. They isolated them from the main system. They were spectacularly successful. As I like to put it, the exception swallowed the rule, and instead of keeping socialism and adopting some ideas, they set up more and more special economic zones. I think Xiamen, went from being a fishing village to a city of 10 or 20 million people. And that's an important part of how China went capitalist. It's, I think, sliding away nowadays, in that unfortunately the present president of China does not seem to be nearly as wise as his predecessor was, but it was quite an important step in what happened to China, abandoning socialism. Kept calling it socialism, but it abandoned it, in fact. The current versions of this, in the United Arab Emirates and Kazakhstan, they set up what they called common law zones, in which they imported English common law for civil and commercial matters. They had their own courts. Ultimately, they were under government control in the sense that the government could change who was on them and such, but they were not under the existing government legal system. And then they tried to attract foreigners who would engage in various economic activities in those zones. The most interesting one, and the one that I've gotten a little more information about recently, is in Honduras. And they are what are called ZEDEs, which is initials of something in Spanish that I don't remember. And one of them has actually been created, Prospera ZEDE, which is on an island in the Honduras. It has its own law, including criminal law in that case. It has private courts. It recognizes private contracts with arbitration to settle them. In principle, the Honduran government would have the power of vetoing rules of those of its private law they didn't like. Since it's a fairly new thing, we don't know whether that'll end up happening at all in practice or not. But think of what's been happening as one to many Hong Kongs. That Hong Kong was in a sense the inspiration. And it's a rather striking case because at the same time that the United Kingdom was becoming less capitalist, Hong Kong was becoming more. And the result was pretty striking. The United Kingdom was, tolerably functioning society, but it wasn't growing very fast. Hong Kong, in something like, 30 or 40 years, went from a dirt poor country with, not really country, polity, with 10 times the population density of the most densely populated country in the world, with an inflow of penniless migrants, to a society where per capita real income was higher than in Britain. So that was a very successful example, and it encouraged other countries to think about whether they had a way of doing something along these lines. Think about competitive systems as a form of private law. And I want to start with a very simple example, and that's corporate law in the US. A US corporation gets to decide what state it will incorporate in. That means the states want some revenues that they get from having corporations incorporated in them, that states are competing to attract corporations. Delaware is the winner in that, and the result is that a very large fraction of US corporations are incorporated in Delaware under Delaware law. Next example. That's a really easy one because it doesn't really cost a corporation anything to decide to incorporate in Delaware instead of in California. Nations, to some extent, have to compete on corporate taxation. The US had very high corporate tax rates. It doesn't anymore. My guess is that Biden will not reverse that change, that we'll wait and see. And the reason is that although corporations are not as free to change what nation they're in as what state they're in, nonetheless, as we've observed, there's a considerable potential for corporations to arrange to earn their income, or at least for accounting purposes, earn their income in the country that gives them the best terms. And therefore, the US was losing out on quite a lot of potential corporate tax by having rates that were too high. Getting to a less state example, in principle, there can be multiple ZEDEs in Honduras. That's how it's set up. Only one has been created yet, but it's still very new. And they would be competing with each other because they would be competing to get investors and individuals to buy land within their territory, to set up businesses, to do various things there. And it's worth realizing that there's really no sharp dividing line between public and private law. That if migration were costless, I have a discussion in my first book, which my son says was part of the inspiration for his seasteading idea, where I imagine a world where everybody lived in a house trailer and it cost nothing to move from one country to another. It looks as though there's going to be a war between France and Germany in my hypothetical, and the next morning the sun rises on an empty landscape. There are some generals and some war correspondents, but all the citizens have left because they don't want to be in the middle of a war. So if you imagine a world where migration is really costless, now all nations are landlords because if they don't give legal rules that people like, people will go somewhere else. Well, between ZEDEs and other embedded cities, migration is much closer to costless. You don't have to be a citizen, so you can freely move among them. You have to physically move if you want to actually be present. And if you've bought some land and are doing things, that land is an immobile resource. But a lot of the important resources, and especially the people, are now mobile. And so you're ending up with a situation where the people who are arranging in Honduras or in the United Arab Emirates or anywhere else, the rules for such systems have a strong private incentive to create legal rules that people want. It's in that sense. So that this is why I spoke a little bit about the Amish, because if there are enough of them and free movement among them, you have a competitive market for private law. And over time, if people would rather have a different and better form of criminal law than those embedded cities that offer that are going to attract more people and more money, and the host nations have an incentive to look the other way because they want the advantages they get out of that. So you might end up with a system, anarchist, even though there were governments that still claimed to rule things. And if you would like to see a quite entertaining fictional version, there's a science fiction novel called Snow Crash, which describes a world where officially the US government still exists, it just doesn't affect anything. I should say, by the way, I don't unfortunately understand Czech, but I heard the word science fiction in the introductory talk. I have not written any science fiction novels. I have written and published 2 fantasy novels, and one novel that was marketed by the publisher as a fantasy but really wasn't, but none of them are actually science fiction. I read science fiction, but so far at least I haven't written any of it. But Snow Crash is a lot of fun. It's sort of a tongue-in-cheek version of anarchokapitalism. All right, let me next talk about the cyberspace version. I've so far been talking about the real space version. Anarchy in cyberspace is something I've been writing about for quite a long time. I wasn't the first person to think of the idea. Public key encryption, as many of you probably know, is the key technology. And since this talk is not mainly about that, I'm not going to go into details, but I'm sure you can find people who can tell you about public key encryption. And what it makes possible is a world where all communication is private, where a stranger can send you a message, and if the message is intercepted, nobody but you can read it, because it is encrypted with your public key, you decrypt it with your private key, and there's no reason for you to ever let anybody else have your private key. There are further methods using remailers or the equivalent, where not only can nobody know what you're saying, nobody can even know who you're talking to. And using private money, which there are ways of producing private eCash. I should say the current cryptocurrencies are not fully private, although they're, in some of them, I think, are making a serious effort to be unobservable. And that means that in such a world, it is very hard for a government to tax or regulate something it can't see. So that means that we've got the potential, to some extent we already have, although not as much as I'd like to see, a world where the online world is an anarchy, is a system that governments can't control. There are bad features as well as good features of this technology. It makes possible criminal firms with brand name reputation. In my book, Future Imperfect, I haven't mentioned that before, but that's actually the book where I discuss this at greatest length, though I have some discussion of it also in the 3rd edition of Machinery of Freedom. And I have a business plan for Murder Incorporated, that at the moment, if you want to kill somebody, we're going to have somebody killed. The real problem is not that you can't afford it. Most of us could afford the price of a hitman. It's that you don't know how to get in contact with a seller of that service without getting in trouble yourself. That problem can be solved in a world of strong privacy, a world with widespread public key encryption. And similarly, a problem that already exists is that this makes it possible to have payoffs for ransomware or for kidnapping, which can't be traced. One of the main ways of catching kidnappers is by watching the money trail. That's not going to work. In such a system, The equivalent, as it were, of a court system is that when any two people are dealing with each other online, they make an agreement on the terms of their arrangements. They sign a contract and digitally sign a contract, which can prove to third parties that both of them agreed to it. The contract includes the public key of the arbitrator they have agreed to. If one of them violates the contract and doesn't pay the damages the arbitrator rules on, then the arbitrator can provide a statement signed with his private key and therefore recognizable with his public key for those familiar with those technologies, which will demonstrate to any interested third party who is the bad guy. And the essential requirement for reputational enforcement, again, a point I've discussed elsewhere, is that there be a low-cost way in which interested third parties, can figure out who is at fault, since you would prefer not to deal with people who break their contracts. So that means that a form of market anarchy may develop and arguably is developing online. And if enough of your life is lived online, so that what's important to you is that web of interactions, social and economic, rather than what's happening in real space, then again, a point I made earlier, governments are only landlords. Because if they try to get from you anything more than the rent of the land you're sitting on, you can move to some other government that offers you better terms. Let me now go on to the future, something I've given lots of talks about, but I'll do a rather sketchy one here, and that's what a fully private future legal system might plausibly look like. What are the institutions I imagine? This is stuff that I imagined when I wrote Machinery about 50 years ago. Each person is the customer of a rights enforcement agency. That agency is a private firm which sells him the service of protecting his rights and settling his disputes. What happens if there are conflicts between customers of different agencies? This is the problem that everybody who looks at this idea and immediately rejects it offers. And the answer is that where I think you've violated my rights and you think you haven't, and we have different agencies, settling them by a war between the agencies would be very expensive, and these are profit-making firms. So it's in the interest of both agencies to agree in advance on a private court, an arbitration agency to settle conflicts between the two. Now, there is, of course, no government in this world to enforce that contract. What enforces the agreement to accept the private court? And the answer is it's enforced by what's sometimes called the discipline of constant dealings. The agencies are repeat players. If my agency refuses to go along when I lose the case, yours will refuse when you lose the case. We're back to fighting each other, and our customers will leave us for more sensible firms. Nobody wants to have his front yard turned into a free fire zone. What kind of laws get produced in this system? That's part of what interests me, because in my view, too much political argument takes the form of, I want outcome X, and not enough what institutions will produce outcome X. The arbitration agency is selling its services to the rights enforcement agencies. So the arbitration agency wants to produce laws and court procedures that the rights enforcement agencies want. The rights enforcement agency is selling its services to its customers. Part of those services is how fast somebody shows up when you call to say you've just been robbed, but part of what they're selling is the legal rules that its customers will be under. So the rights enforcement agency wants to buy the laws that its customers want. Unlike a political system, the customer has a choice in which enforcement agency he's a customer of, which not only means he can move, it also means that it pays him to know which ones are doing a good job. That in a political system, you know that your vote has very close to zero chance of changing the outcome. So there's no good reason to be well informed, which is part of the reason that a sizable fraction of the US population at the moment is living in a fantasy in which Trump really won the election and it was all stolen from him, which I think is pretty clearly not true. But it doesn't cost very much to live in that fantasy, and if your friends share the fantasy, they won't like you if you don't. And there are lots and lots of other examples. And I used to do the experiment when I was teaching undergraduates of asking how many of them knew the name of their congressman. And about half of them did. And it's really hard to pay attention to what someone is doing if you don't know his name. And furthermore, unlike a political system, you get to see both alternatives. We don't get to see what Trump's second term would have looked like, but you do get to see what different cars look like, and in this system, what the quality of service provided by different rights enforcement agencies are. Rather like buying ordinary goods. But it's not exactly like buying ordinary goods, because the law between me and you is the law between you and me, so we can't each get exactly the law we want. However, we can each have our preferences reflected in the bargaining of the firms we're customers of. Not only what we want, but also how much we want it, which matters. My firms, imagine the easy case is one where everybody agrees, where we all want the same legal rules. But think about the case where we disagree, where I've got a bunch of customers who are in favor of the death penalty, and you have a bunch of customers who are against the death penalty. Each firm does some market research and says, how much is it worth to us to get the rule we want? How much more could we charge our customers if we guaranteed that in interactions with that other agency, they would have the legal rule they want? Whichever rule is worth more, the two agencies agree on it, and one firm will either pay the other for its agreement or give the other firm its way on some other issue. So you've got a bargaining mechanism which is going to tend to give you those legal rules that maximize the summed benefit to the customers. All right. So that's what economists refer to as an efficient outcome, like the outcome of an ordinary competitive market. Are those rules libertarian? Some of us care about that. Do they respect individual liberty? Maybe. Libertarians believe that liberty works. That it is very rarely the case that the benefit to you of violating my rights is larger than the cost to me. And if that's the case, then legal rules in which rights are respected will be efficient. But there could be exceptions. You can imagine a case, for example, in which everybody believes that heroin use is a terrible thing. In that case, the market for law will generate laws against heroin use, even if you believe, as I do, that such laws violate the individual right to control, for an individual to control what goes into his body. But then, under those circumstances, with everybody believing that, an ordinary political system will also produce those laws, and did. So what we can expect under anarchokapitalism is a private market to produce laws that are more libertarian than the laws that would be produced by a political system, but not perfectly libertarian. Now, somebody who's in favor of a small libertarian government could say, aha, my system is better than yours. In my system, we have a legal rule which doesn't allow any violation of rights. Therefore, it's better than your anarchy, where you've just confessed. It might lead to some laws that were rights violating. To which my reply is, why do you expect your minarchy to behave that way? It isn't sufficient to say if it violates rights, it isn't my minarchy. You can't use definitions to create political institutions. In just the same way, one of my competitors in the anarcho-capitalist market, as it were, argues that in his system, the legal system will never include any rules that allow the initiation of coercion. Why? Because if it does, he won't call it his system. And that's not an argument for a set of institutions. It's only a piece of wishful thinking. There are some problems with the analysis I've just sketched very briefly. I go into them a little bit in the first edition of Machinery of Freedom and in much more detail in the third and current edition. One of them is the existence of market failure on the market for law. On ordinary markets, there are situations, things like public good problems and externalities, where an individual actor doesn't receive the benefit of what he does or doesn't pay the cost, and therefore the incentives for the individual actor are different from the incentives for all of us put together. And that's going to apply to this market. You can think of situations where the legal rule between A and B has important effects on C. Since A's agency and B's agency are bargaining to the rule, they ignore those effects. All right. So again, this is a chapter in the third edition of Machinery. Furthermore, part of what I left out of the marketing story was the question of who has to pay whom. What's the default? What's the starting point? If we agree that the efficient rule is no death penalty, does that mean that the anti-death penalty agency has to pay the pro-death penalty agency for its agreement? Or does it only mean that the anti-death penalty agency has to turn down an offer for payment by the pro agency? This was the subject of the one good review Machinery of Freedom got by Jim Buchanan. Later got a Nobel Prize, I think later. And it's a good review because it made me think. And I spend, again, a chapter in the third edition trying to discuss the issues raised by that question. And again, if I were giving a talk just on that, I would cover it, but I cut those slides out because this talk is covering a lot of other stuff. Conclusion. Anarcho-capitalism will tend to produce economically efficient law, which will tend to be libertarian law, both only approximations. But we have better reasons to expect both efficiency and freedom than with any other institutions, at least that I know of, for producing law. Electing Ayn Rand as dictator doesn't count as an institution. Anarcho-capitalism may or may not be able to defend against states. That's what I call the hard problem, and I've discussed ways it might do it. It may, under some circumstances, be unstable against a coalition to recreate government. So if there are only 3 rights enforcement agencies, they might decide that robbing people is more profitable than selling services to them. If there are 100, they won't. And I've then discussed the question of how many there are likely to be and what will determine that. Let me make, sort of more or less in closing, a general point about competitive law and law enforcement. The Amish are the examples that I really was mostly starting with, where you have multiple congregations in a settlement. Free movement among them may or may not require geographical movement. So that means that the congregations are in effect constrained to produce legal rules people want to live under. The special economic zones, the ZEDEs in Honduras and the like, are embedded institutions under multiple governments. There may be multiple ZEDEs just in Honduras. There are multiple zones around the world. Each zone has a geographical location, but you don't have to be a citizen to own property and be under the legal system and live there and all the rest of it. So you have free migration. So that means that you have a competitive system there. Crypto anarchy is a non-geographical system. You don't have to move to change your arbitrator. It doesn't really have a formal law code in that sense, but anytime you agree to a contract with somebody else, interacting online, many things you don't bother with a contract, you just go by people's reputation, of course. But if it's something important, you can sign a contract, which in effect is your own little mini legal system, setting up the rules between you, and then use arbitration and reputation to enforce it. And anarcho-capitalism is sort of the full-blown version of this sort of thing, in which it's not embedded, there is no government over it, there are multiple rights enforcement agencies, multiple arbitration agencies, and it's non-geographical, so you have a free choice of agency. That, I think, concludes what I had to say today. If you want much more on this stuff, read the Machinery of Freedom, the third edition, which has a lovely cover that I got done by putting up a contest on my blog for people to design a cover, and I got the best cover I think I've ever had. You can get it from Amazon as Kindle or a printed book, and there's also an audiobook read by me. Also take a look at Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, my most recent book, which covers lots of legal systems, but including several stateless ones. And you might also want to look at Future Imperfect, which I forgot to put on this slide, but that's a book where I discuss a lot of technological developments that might revolutionize the world in the next 30 years or so. And that includes some of the ones I've talked about, especially what I refer to as strong privacy, the world that gives you crypto anarchy. Thank you. I think that concludes what I want to say. I think we now get a question period. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor. It was a very nice talk. I have your book here, so this is the one with the beautiful cover, right?
Correct. It's essentially a steampunk bird for the idea of combining machinery with freedom.
As I was saying in the introduction in Czech, unfortunately we didn't translate it into Czech yet, but maybe in the near future we can do something.
There is a Russian translation, which I think may have just come out. It's supposed to have come out. They said they're going to send me some copies. I have no idea how reliable it is because I don't read Russian, unfortunately. And I don't always trust translators, but it was obviously done by enthusiasts, and we will hope that it worked out well. And I assume that there are still some people in Czechia who read Russian and don't read English, although I would guess that the number of such people has been declining over time.
Yeah, possibly there are people like this, like the generation of our parents and grandparents, maybe. So we'll have to give them the machinery of freedom in Russian for Christmas.
Yes. And the second edition of Machinery is also a free PDF on my webpage. People may want to look at my webpage, which is daviddfriedman.com. You need the D in the middle because somebody else grabbed davidfriedman.com first. And that includes links to the full text of a number of my books and most of my published articles, both economics and political. And some people may also want to look at my blog called Ideas, and there is a link to that on the webpage. So it's easy to find, and that's whatever I feel like talking about, and there's been a lot of things over the last 15 or 16 years.
Yeah, we provided the links in the description to the lecture, so I really recommend everybody to visit that. And also very cool that you narrate your own audiobook.
Yes, I've narrated a bunch of audiobooks. I have one audiobook that someone else narrated. That's my second novel, which is called Salamander. And I think he did a very good job. I think he did a better job than I would have done. And that's now available, and I hope some people will listen to it because I think it's neat. I should say my fiction is not libertarian in any very strong sense. It's certainly influenced both by the fact that I'm a libertarian and by the fact that I'm an economist, but it doesn't exist for the purpose of preaching either libertarianism or economics. It exists for the purpose of telling a story. And I have, my first novel was published by Bain. It's called Harald. It was marketed as fantasy, but it's really a historical novel with made-up history and geography, and I liked it. Some other people did, some didn't. And then I have two more that are fantasies. One of them is a sequel to the other. Salamander is the first of those, and Brothers is the second. And part of the fun of those was that I was trying to invent sort of a science of magic, or invent a plausible scientific basis, not in our science, that is, this is a world with different laws than ours, as it were, and create the illusion that it was really there. So the setting of those books is a world about 50 years after the magical equivalent of Newton. That magic has been a craft for centuries, and someone has finally begun to figure out how it works, and that is gradually affecting the society. Anyway, it was fun.
I see.
But I have to admit, my fictional books don't sell nearly as well as my non-fictional books. Probably because there are a lot of people who are better fiction writers than I am.
And for the record, I didn't say you were a science fiction author. I said you were a fan.
Then I misunderstood. I only heard the word science fiction in the introduction. But But since I didn't know the language, I couldn't tell its context. However, people often assert that I've written science fiction.
I also said that you were a fan of games and computer games. That is correct.
I am a fan of computer games, of science fiction, of fantasy, and of a variety of other things. And one of my hobbies is cooking from medieval recipes.
Oh, well, great. I'll have a look if we have some questions from the audience, because I don't want to take all the time. I've seen 2 questions here. Robertas from Vilnius is asking, what is your perspective on the view that our current state of affairs only a logical, inevitable result in the continuum of anarchical development from state of nature to big groups and large-scale agreements, i.e. nation-states, and whatever comes next, is it, if it is not the end result yet? Did you understand the question?
That is, there's a sense in which one can argue that whatever is must be inevitable, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened. But what is changes over time, and it changes partly because of things like technological change, but also ideas affect the world. There is a phone ringing, but it's not mine. It's in the other room. Just a minute. Brief interruption. Hello, I'm on doing something online, so I can't talk at the moment. Sorry about that. I turned off my landline and my cell phone, but I did not turn off the bedroom phone for the landline, and it's close enough so you can hear the ring. So going back to that, there is surely some reason why we currently have a world full of states. I think that part is right. But on the other hand, things change. I like to point out that if you went back to, say, 1800 or maybe 1700, and you said, I've imagined this very different world in which most people live in societies where the government spends between 30 and 50% of national income. They're democracies where everybody gets to vote, even women, and the law is the same for men and women. There are no laws against homosexuality, all sorts of things like that. Any contemporary would say that's crazy, that couldn't exist, we never had anything like that before, and yet that's now the normal situation in the developed world. So my view is that things can change. Partly technology helps changing it, that the fact that transportation is much cheaper and communication is much faster and cheaper than it used to be makes competition among legal regimes easier. And at the same time, ideas affect things. And I think that the ideas I'm trying to propagate make it easier for people to imagine different ways of doing things, some of which may work. But I'm not a prophet. I offer no guarantees that the world will be better next decade than this decade. I am, however, an optimist. Hope that answers some of your question.
The next question is also from Robertas. What, in your view, is the difference between laissez-faire capitalism, where government is completely separated from economics, i.e. citizens are free not to contribute to institutions like courts, but then are not protected by them, and the anarchical state that you imagine?
Sorry, the question is, imagine a society where individuals are free to opt out of the tax system, but are then not protected. And then the question is, are they allowed to be protected by somebody else? So that if you have a system...
Is there any difference between this thing and the anarchy that you imagine in the book?
And that depends, I think, on whether the governments permit competition. That if you have a system of that sort, but if I go to a private rights enforcement agency and I say, look, this person has stolen my property, the government isn't protecting me because I've opted out of the government, will you please go to that person and use the threat of force to make him give back what he took? If the government's response to that is, sorry, you're not allowed to do that, we have a monopoly of retaliatory force, then it is not an anarchist system. If the government has no special rights beyond those of any rights enforcement agency, then it is an anarchist system. I think that would be the essential answer. This is, in a sense, part of an argument that I've had with objectivists, with Ayn Rand followers, where they, on the one hand, claim that it's never proper to initiate force, but on the other hand, don't want anarchy. And their system is one in which the government doesn't collect taxes, it sells its services, but in which it prevents anybody else from selling the same services in competition with it. And that is, it seems to me, a violation of rights, that either what the government is doing in using retaliatory force to enforce people's rights is or is not itself an initiation of force. If it is, the government shouldn't do it. And if it isn't, then other people should be allowed to do it, and stopping them is an initiation of force. That's an argument that I had many years ago and keep having from time to time with my objectivist friends.
See. There's a question from Bob. Snowball nature of money is an issue because naturally there will be an enforcement company which will have the most customers, therefore also most income and most money. And the more money you have, the better and cheaper services you can provide, and with disadvantage you get to produce even more money and so on. That means that with time and an agency will develop a massive uncontestable army and will have the power to become a dictatorship. What is your view on this?
My view is that this is assuming that there are always economies of scale rather than diseconomies of scale. The same argument would seem to imply that there should be one restaurant firm that runs all the restaurants in the world. That as the restaurant firm gets bigger and bigger, it should be able to do better and better. It seems to imply one car manufacturer in the world. That isn't what happened. That in fact, while natural monopolies occasionally occur, and a natural monopoly occurs if the advantages of size outweigh the disadvantages up to a size large enough to fill the entire market. If that happens, then you get a natural monopoly. And much more commonly, however, as firms get bigger, they get some advantages from getting bigger, but as they get bigger, the number of layers between the person at the top and the people actually doing the work at the bottom gets larger and larger. That means it's harder and harder for the person at the top to either control the people at the bottom or even know what they're doing. And you then get organizational diseconomies of scale. So one of the things I discussed way back in the first edition of Machinery, I say almost 50 years ago, was what sort of economies of scale you would expect in the rights enforcement industry. And the point I made there was that insofar as you can judge by present police forces in towns and in the US at least, it doesn't look as though big cities do a much better job at a lower cost of enforcing the law than small towns. Now, it's not a perfect competition, but I don't think there's any good reason to assume that you always end up with the maximum possible size. What the size is going to depend on where the economies of scale stop happening.
Thank you. There's a question from Martin. What forces are pushing a state to create ZEDs? Why should they arise?
Yes, and I think the answer is that the obvious place to have it happen, though not the only one, is in countries that are poor and underdeveloped and don't want to be. And presumably, my impression, I don't think that Honduras is proposing to tax the CED. I don't know. A different case, which I am familiar with and didn't include in this talk, is the history of Jewish communities after the destruction of the Kingdom of Israel. Because one of the interesting things is that for nearly 2,000 years after the Roman Empire had destroyed the Kingdom of Israel, most Jews in the world lived under Jewish law. And they did so because the Christian and Muslim rulers found that the easiest way of dealing with their Jewish subjects was to subcontract the job to the Jewish communal authorities. So you had, in effect, embedded states, in fact, each town, an embedded society, But in that case, they did it for taxes, so that the communal authorities had agreed, in effect, we'll provide the following amount of tax money, we'll then worry about collecting it, and we'll make the rules for our own people, and so forth. And so one possibility would be the idea that because this is going to be much more prosperous than what we're already doing, they will be willing to pay us off a amount that is modest to them but high to us. But the other possibility is that they believe there will be lots of side benefits, that after all, if you've got a bunch of relatively, by their standards, rich people in this island in Honduras, those people are going to go elsewhere in Honduras to buy stuff and sell stuff and do things, and that'll provide taxes to the government. It'll make the Honduras a more attractive and interesting country. Citizens of Honduras may find that the ZEDE provides high-quality services of various sorts, maybe medical services, say, they can't get at home. So you would, I think the basic idea is that those countries that think they will benefit by having something there in their territory, and countries that have a good deal of unused land, as I say, the first one in Honduras was an island, and I'm assuming it was an island that where not much was happening. It maybe belonged to the government, I don't know, or belonged to private people who were willing to sell it. So I think that's basically why it happens. And of course, there'll be countries that don't. And there will be countries that double-cross the investors, that it's not clear what's actually happening in Kazakhstan at this point. But on the other hand, there are reputational effects. A lot of the valuable capital is human capital, and that's going to leave if you don't treat it well. So I think it's likely to be a diverse and interesting world, and it's not a world I know a lot about, and a lot of it hasn't happened yet, so nobody knows much about it. I know that my elder son, Patri, who was one of the people who invented the idea of seasteading, more recently has been trying to run an investment fund for investing in projects of this sort. If he were here, he could tell you how well it's going. I don't know.
Well, we'll have to invite your son for a future lecture so that we can learn more about this. There's a question from Jakob. Can you tell us your favorite medieval recipe?
Oh boy, I can't. I can tell you that my wife and I self-published a medieval cookbook with about 300 recipes in it, giving both the original version and how we do it. Typically, medieval recipes don't include unnecessary details such as quantities, temperatures, and times. So part of what you're doing is taking a verbal description and trying to convert it into a recipe. And I could certainly describe some things that I like very much. One of the things that we make at home pretty commonly is a pasta dish, a noodle dish called rishta, in which you take lamb and lentils and cinnamon and water, and you then make noodles by kneading together flour and water and rolling it out and cutting it into thin strips and dump it into the boiling liquid, and it ends up as quite a tasty noodle dish. And I should say there's a widespread false belief that pasta was brought back from China by Marco Polo. But this particular recipe is a Middle Eastern recipe from, I think, a century or so before Marco Polo. But that would be only one example. There are quite a lot of medieval recipes we like. But if you go either on my webpage, you can get a PDF of our cookbook, which is called How to Milk an Almond, Stuff an Egg, and Armor a Turnip, those being references to some particular weird recipe titles. And you can download a PDF from my webpage, or if you want a printed copy, you can get it on Amazon. But that would be one example, but there are quite a lot of recipes. There are quite a lot of things that we like well enough, so we make them at home sort of pretty routinely as part of our home cooking. We had a spinach cheese tart a couple of days ago that's from a different medieval source.
It sounds good. I hope Jakob is satisfied with that as well, and maybe we'll buy the cookbook. I saw
you can even get it for free if he wants the PDF.
He can get it for free. Could you Andre asks, could you recommend any, in your opinion, relevant critique of your thoughts?
That's an interesting question. There's an essay you can find online by Murray Rothbard, where he explains that what's wrong with me is that I don't hate the state. And he's correct. Not that it's wrong, but that is to say, part of my disagreement with Rothbard, who's no longer alive, so unfortunately he can't continue the argument, is that he thinks of the state as sort of an evil conspiracy by people who want to steal from the rest of us and oppress the rest of us. And I think of it as an intellectual mistake. I assume that most people who believe in having a government thinks that you need to have a government to have a society work tolerably well. They might be right. I don't think I've got a rigorous proof that my system would work. I've got some arguments for why I think it would work. And therefore, I really see it as an argument, not a war. And so if you Google for Rothbard, Friedman, hate the state, you can probably find it. Or alternatively, if you look on my blog, which is called Ideas, with a little effort, if you do a search on my blog for Rothbard, one of the blog posts is one which links to that article by him and then gives my response to it. So that would be one critique. As I was mentioning earlier, Jim Buchanan's review of Machinery of Freedom, back when it was first published, is another. And his point was that I hadn't thought about the question of what the default was. If agency A and agency B don't agree on the death penalty, what rules apply? And without a default, we don't know who has to pay whom in order to shift away from it. And I respond, I don't know how you would find that. It was an old review. I may have a cite to it in Machinery, I'm not sure. But that was a critique of it, and you can find my response to that in Machinery. But other than that, I don't think I know a good criticism. Most of the web ones I've seen seem to be people who don't understand the ideas very well. I should say, back in the days when I did my arguing online on Usenet, I was part of a group called Humanities Philosophy Objectivism, a Usenet group where I argued with objectivists, with Ayn Rand followers. And the person who did the best job of critiquing my ideas there was Jimmy Wales, who later went on to be one of the founders of Wikipedia. And I suppose if you looked hard enough, you could probably find archived versions of Usenet with his arguments. But I think he did not fully understand the system, although he had some ideas in at least the right direction. But other than that, I'm afraid I don't know. You should probably ask. The Mises Institute is run by people who are fans of Rothbard, and you can certainly find various unkind things Rothbard has said about me by searching stuff there. But I don't know anything that I would consider really a critique of my ideas.
And now I feel like I have to ask the question, because I have the books here. Your parents, did they offer good criticism, or did they agree with you? Because I have the book here, Free to Choose, by your parents. So yes, well, and we published it this year, so I feel like I have to ask this question.
Yeah, I think my view is that anarchokapitalism might not work, but probably would. And I think my father's view was that it might work, but probably wouldn't. And it's sort of hard to argue that kind of thing, because it's not as if we have good machinery for figuring out the probability of things breaking down in one way or another. But I think the fundamental difference between my views and my father's was not that we disagreed, but that we were interested in different questions. That the question he was interested in and made enormous contributions to is, given the world as it is, how do we improve it? What are plausible changes that we have some hope of getting into law that would make the world better? So that his really final project, both of my parents' final project, was setting up a foundation to push the idea of school choice, of voucher systems, in order that you would, instead of having a government monopoly of education, or of schooling more precisely, which is the case in, I think, very nearly every country in the world, you would have a competitive market for schooling, in which his proposal was the government keeps funding it, but if you send your child to a private school, you get the money that would have gone to school him at a public school to spend on the private school. You then have a competitive market. And he thought that would greatly improve the U.S. and in part improve it politically, because you no longer have a system in which everybody was being educated by the government and therefore getting the government's side of all stories. I'm a member of the board of directors of that organization. I strongly approve of it. I would rather have a fully private system, but it's clear that that's not a practical option, whereas at this point, a little over 1% of all U.S. Students are in voucher systems of one sort or another, and we're hoping to push it up to 5%, maybe 10%, maybe more eventually. So that's a case where he was interested in plausible changes, pushing the boundaries of what can now be done, and I was really more interested in the intellectual question of, if you carried these ideas all the way, what would it look like? So that was the basic disagreement. So I wouldn't say we really had much. I certainly spent lots of my life arguing with my father, but not over this particular set of issues as far as I can remember.
Okay, thank you. Yaroslav is asking, can you share your opinion on the modern monetary theory, if you have any? And he's thanking for a lot for an optimistic lecture.
Yes. I'm afraid the answer is that I don't know enough about it, and I think the term covers more than one thing. I think the idea that some people seem to have, that the government can print as much money as it wants in order to spend things without any negative consequences, is nonsense. But beyond that, in general, let me go back a step. The reason I originally went into physics, although I was interested in economics, was that I didn't want to spend my life being identified primarily as my father's son. And I eventually concluded that I was a better economist than a physicist. I enjoyed it more and had more useful new ideas, so I switched fields. But I have continued to stay out of my father's area, which was basically macroeconomics. That my specialty for the last 30 years or so has been economic analysis of law. I've done some other things, like the legal system is very different, and a number of things that are basically what I think of as price theory. Really have never gotten seriously involved in the kind of macro issues which so-called modern monetary theory is a version of. So I don't feel competent to critique it, but I am suspicious of at least the conclusions some people seem to make. But it's worth realizing that for any of these things, it isn't really one thing. So people ask me, what do I think of Austrian economics? Well, I think Hayek is, one of the people I dedicated Machinery of Freedom to. Not for what I would think of as Austrian economics, but for a particular perceptive idea that I got from him that I thought was important. And Austrian economists range from people who take what I think is an indefensible methodological position to perfectly reasonable people who are doing interesting stuff other than what I'm doing. And similarly, I suspect that there are probably people who call themselves modern monetary theorists who have ideas that I might agree with, as well as some who pretty clearly don't, and who are using it as sort of a new version of the very popular idea we've got the printing press so we can spend as much money as we want.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Veet. When do you expect some kind of developed anarchokapitalism society to first evolve somewhere?
As far as the full version of anarcho-capitalism, not in my lifetime, unless they solve the aging problem, which I hope but don't really expect will happen in time for me. So I would say, I'm not a prophet, but I would be very surprised if a full-blown version of anarcho-capitalism showed up in the next 30 years, say. I would not be surprised, however, if the sort of thing I was talking about in terms of competing embedded systems gave you a lot of the results of that within that period of time. I think it's beginning to happen already. Similarly, I would not be astonished if you ended up with an effectively anarcho-capitalist system online within the next few decades. I wouldn't be astonished if you didn't either. As I say, I'm not a prophet. It's very hard to know what's going to happen in the future. But obviously, governments have a strong incentive to try to prevent it. That the U.S. government certainly doesn't really like public key encryption. They don't like ways in which people can do things they can't observe. On the other hand, it's sort of hard to prevent it. And so I don't know how much of that's going to develop. Some of it is developing. You've got essentially online black markets. I've followed that well enough to know how successful they are in staying out of sight of the government. But that's certainly the objective of such systems. But as far as the full version that I sketched in machinery, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. It might happen in the next century if we're lucky.
Matt is asking, what do you think about copyright and intellectual property? Hypothetically, if I took your book, translated it into Czech, and put it on my blog, would you take a legal action against me?
The answer is I would not take a legal action against you. My view as an economist is that there are arguments both for and against intellectual property. I've sometimes claimed to be the only libertarian in the world who doesn't know the answer to the question, should there be IP? Because my observation is that some libertarians, such as Ayn Rand, who was a libertarian even if she didn't like the label, think that intellectual property is the most defensible form of property rights, and a fair number of others think it's the least defensible. And I think that there are arguments for and against, and there are costs and benefits to intellectual property, just as in general there are costs and benefits to property. That there are reasons why it makes sense for some things to be commons. All right, the interesting alternative is not government property versus private property, it's property versus commons. And there are reasons why it made sense for a long time for the air to be a commons. It doesn't belong to anybody, you don't need permission to breathe. It makes sense in many places, but not all, for the water in a river to be a commons. It makes sense for the English language to be a commons. There's nobody who owns words and who you've got to pay a licensing fee to use them. So this is a different book. If you read my book, Law's Order, which is about economic analysis of law, I have 2 chapters, one of which is about property and one of which is about intellectual property. I suggest reasons why some things are more suited to be intellectual property than others, just as some physical things are more suited to be property than others. But I don't really have an opinion on whether we'd be better off with no intellectual property law. I do have an opinion about what I myself do, though. And in fact, my most useful interaction with all of this was that I discovered years ago that somebody had converted my Machinery of Freedom, I think the second edition of Machinery of Freedom, if I remember correctly. It might have been the first. Yeah, I think either the first or second edition, had converted that to a PDF and webbed it. And this was in violation of my copyright. And I told my publisher about it, and it vanished, and then it reappeared. And I figured that if my publisher wanted to try to enforce the right, which they controlled at that time, that was up to them, but I wasn't being paid to enforce the copyright. So what I did instead was to download it. And that was very useful because Machinery of Freedom was written before word processors. So when I started work on, I think this would have been the third edition. I think the second edition I may have had a word processor for, but the first edition I certainly didn't. So I downloaded the PDF, converted it from a PDF back to Word, and that gave me a machine-readable version of the text, which was something I didn't have. And I then used that in doing the third edition. So I like to say I pirated my pirate. If you feel like doing a translation into Czechia, into Czech, I will be happy to give you permission to do that. The people who did the Russian translation politely asked me for my permission, and I gave them permission for that. So in general, in my case, I write books primarily to spread ideas, not primarily as a source of income. So that's why probably most of my books, I guess, certainly most of my nonfiction books, are available on my webpage in one form or another to be read for free.
There's a question from Jakub again. Did your education in physics anyhow help you with your economic ideas?
I think with the economic ideas, certainly having good mathematical intuition is helpful for doing economics. But I like to claim that the main thing I got out of a PhD in theoretical physics was that I could do non-mathematical economics and not have people think that I was afraid of mathematics. Because I think there's too much mathematics in modern economics. That is, mathematics is certainly a useful tool. There's a letter by Alfred Marshall, who was arguably the most important economist of the late 19th century. He's the person who really put together what we now think of as neoclassical economics, although several other people were doing closely related things at the same time. And Marshall comments somewhere that he always worked through his ideas mathematically to make sure they were right, and he then translated them into English. And if he was unable to translate the mathematics into English, he burned the mathematics. And I have a good deal of sympathy with that, because sometimes when you translate your mathematics or somebody else's mathematics into English, it turns out that it's crazy. It doesn't really make any sense. That there are a number of cases I've observed where somebody gets a really striking result, and when you think it through carefully, you realize that the result is not driven by the problem he's analyzing, but by his simplifying assumptions. That the result would not be true without those simplifying assumptions. And that's much easier to do if you don't put it in words, because mathematical symbols are much less intuitive to us than language. So I use math from time to time in what I do, but I don't use it nearly as much as the sort of modern fashions. My friend and colleague Gordon Tullock used to refer to ornamental mathematics, meaning mathematics included in an article to make the article feel snazzy, even though it didn't really add anything. And I have tried to avoid ornamental mathematics.
Mm-hmm. There are two more questions. I hope we have the time for them. Matt is asking, what is your opinion on the non-aggression principle?
It's a good first approximation, but it's not more than that. That if you imagine a situation where a small violation of rights produces an enormous benefit in other forms, you should probably do it. So my standard extreme example is an asteroid is approaching Earth, large asteroid, and if it hits Earth, it will wipe out all life on Earth. It happens by some bizarre set of circumstances that there's a way of stopping the asteroid. But to stop the asteroid, you have to steal something worth a nickel from somebody who is its rightful owner. And it happens that you know that the rightful owner is a unhappy person who doesn't like the rest of the human race and doesn't care if the human race is wiped out. So if you ask him to give you this thing, he will say no. You steal it. Now, people could say, but that's preventing further aggression, but it isn't, because the asteroid isn't a person. The asteroid wiping out all life on Earth is not a violation of rights. It's a very unfortunate activity. And I can think of other examples of that sort. So my general view, I guess another example I like, and this one was originated, I think, by Bill Bradford, who was the late Bill Bradford, unfortunately, who was the editor of Liberty magazine, which I used to write for. And his example is that you carelessly fall off the balcony of your apartment on the 10th floor of an apartment building. Luckily, you catch hold of the flagpole of the apartment underneath you, the 9th floor apartment, and you are moving up that flagpole to the balcony of that apartment hand over hand, when the owner of the apartment comes out to the balcony and says, "Let go. I don't give you permission to use my flagpole." His flagpole. If you really believe that you never initiate coercion, you shouldn't be using his flagpole. I don't let go. So I think the answer is that you shouldn't initiate coercion is a good rule of thumb, that a world where people are very reluctant to initiate coercion would be a better world than the one we have, but I don't think it really is the kind of rigorous argument that people often claim it to be.
Bohumil is asking, in your vision, do you see a difference between lawmaking companies and enforcement companies?
Could be either way. If you think about automobiles, is there a difference between companies that make tires and companies that make cars? Well, I think at the moment the answer is yes, that I believe the car companies buy their tires from tire companies. On the other hand, how about cars and batteries? As far as I can tell, Tesla both makes cars and makes at least many, though not all, of the batteries that go into those cars. Similarly here, the system that I originally described was one in which those were separate activities. On the other hand, in the various sort of competing embedded systems, I think often they're combined. Political system in some sense, with the legislature making the laws, but you then had enforcement entirely private. And my guess is that in some cases laws were made but didn't get enforced. So it didn't really exist for a practical standpoint. So I think there isn't a general answer to that question. That would depend on the particular institutions of the particular society.
If you have time, there are 2 more questions now.
I have time to answer 2 more questions, yes.
Jan is asking, do you believe that the wealth distribution would converge to something healthy in anarchokapitalism?
I don't know what healthy means there. I don't think you can predict that. That is to say, there are some ways in which the present state system tends to make the wealth distribution more unequal. In particular, it makes it more static. It makes it harder for people to break in. So that, for example, there are many activities which you require a license from the government to do. And that means that they are likely to be reserved for people who have enough money and enough status and enough expertise to get through the licensing mechanism. So that if you think about what prevents a hardworking, intelligent person who is born in the black inner city from making a lot of money, and I suspect a lot of it is the fact that many of the things that he would like to do are things you can't do without having gone to college, without having done various things. So I think that situation would improve quite a lot. But at the same time, the government also does various things which make it harder to make a lot of money, and the government also redistributes a certain amount from rich to poor. It's not clear if the redistribution makes the ultimate income distribution more or less equal. First, government sometimes redistribute from poor to rich as well. You get things like states that subsidize opera, for example. But beyond that, to the extent that welfare makes being poor less unpleasant, it also reduces the incentive to do the things you need to do to get out of poverty. One of the points I found quite striking when I came across it is that in the U.S., from about the end of World War II, which is as far back as we have good data, to the point at which the war on poverty got fully funded and staffed. This was a government program started by Lyndon Johnson, which was supposed to end poverty. That's what it claimed to do. Up to the time when that got started, the percentage of the population who was poor was falling quite sharply. From the time the war on poverty got fully going to the present, the percentage of the population that was poor has stayed roughly the same. It goes up and down with economic fluctuations. So that suggests that while the war on poverty was supposed to end poverty, what it actually did was they gave up on ending poverty. There's a book by Murray, I think, called Losing Ground, which describes that, and instead settled for simply making being poor less unpleasant, but doing that meant there was less tendency to end poverty. And I think in general, government intervention in lots of ways makes the society less flexible and makes it harder to work through. So I can't really say what the effect would be. I could imagine in any direction. Nor am I even sure what healthy means. That from my standpoint, poor people getting less poor is a good thing. Rich people getting richer is a good thing too. That I don't think that, you could imagine a society where somebody was so rich that he could push everybody around, but given that in realistic societies there are lots of rich people as well as lots of poor people and lots of people in the middle, I don't think that's too likely. So I don't really think in terms of healthy distribution of income, but only do you have a society in which everybody is doing reasonably well. And I think that would be more likely to happen if the government wasn't interfering in a lot of ways. That if you think of U.S. schooling, for example, the inner city schools are, as far as I can tell, doing very little to educate people in practice. I don't really have an answer to the question, nor do I know what a healthy distribution of income would be.
And Dominic is asking, there are many people in the Czech Republic who highly respect your father, but totally hate anarcho-capitalism, especially among Czech alt-rights, paleo-conservatives, etc. What would you tell them?
I don't know why a paleo-conservative would particularly respect my father. That my father, like me, was in favor of immigration. Indeed, my father argued that under present circumstances, illegal immigration was a good thing. That the best thing would be to have legal immigration where you didn't have welfare, which was basically the situation in the US until some point in the 20th century. The US had essentially open migration until about the 1920s, with the exception of some restrictions on Chinese immigrants, maybe other Orientals, I'm not sure. But that since we did have welfare, the next best was to have illegal immigrants, because since they're illegal, they wouldn't be collecting welfare, and immigration is a good thing. So I don't know why paleo-conservatives would particularly like him. He was in favor of free trade, of course, as most economists are in favor of. So beyond that, I'm in favor of most of the things my father is in favor of. I just think that the principles can be carried even farther than he was trying to carry them. But ordinary conservatives might like him, but basically my father was not a conservative. He was a liberal in the old sense of the term, a classical liberal, which basically he would have said that he was politically a Republican and ideologically a libertarian, or a liberal. The term liberal, at least in the US, got stolen by its opponents back in the early 20th century. That's less true in Europe. That's why we had to steal libertarian from the from the left anarchists who were using the term libertarian before that.
Okay, but
I'd like to say it's all right.
Rephrase the question. Sure. If there are people who highly respect your father but hate anarcho-capitalism, what ideas or what do you have to tell them to maybe become more approachable by anarcho-capitalist ideas?
I'd have to know why they hate I'd have to know why they hate anarcho-capitalism to answer that question. That is, what do I have to say for anarcho-capitalism? Read Machinery of Freedom. That's the arguments that I've offered for it. But beyond that, I can't answer an argument without hearing it. And presumably, some of them want to have a government to maintain the features of their society, but then we observe governments often do things that undercut features of their society. That many of the things that people want to do are things that can be done by private contract. If you really want to have a society where nobody is allowed to get divorced, well, if enough people feel that way, you can have your own town, and the agreement in that town would be that we all agree not to rent to divorced people or something, and you could do the same thing with regard to homosexuals or anything else, but you don't get to stop other people from doing other things their way. But as I say, I really can't answer an argument without hearing it. So if you could provide me with some Czech conservatives who can tell me why anarcho-capitalism is terrible, I will be happy to try to show them why they're wrong. That's the best I'm afraid I can do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've gone through all the questions that I am able to see, and I'll just do the formal conclusion here. Normally I would present you a diploma saying you are the laureate of the annual prize of the Liberal Institute, but I didn't print a diploma for this session, but I'll be happy to mail it to you. And
I hope to get to Prague this summer with luck, if all goes well with vaccines and the pandemic is over by that time. So you can mail it to me, or I can just plan on picking it up sometime around June or July.
That would be terrific. We would love to see you here in Prague again. I know you had a lecture in our institute maybe some 10 years ago or something like this.
I don't remember. I don't keep track of when I give which, but I know that I have spoken in Prague, and I think I visited Prague, I think, a couple of times. It's a nice city. I have not yet succeeded in learning to like beer. I realized that Prague was famous for its beer. I've never been a beer drinker, so I tried the experiment last time I was there, but I'm afraid I still don't like beer. But other than that, I thought Prague was a fine place, and I'd like to visit it again.
Maybe some medieval beer.
Maybe. I probably know people. I've made a not quite medieval. I've made a 17th century small mead, and that's quite tasty, actually. Small mead meaning it's not very alcoholic. And there certainly are people making. Certainly, there are people I know of who make medieval mead, and there are almost certainly people who make medieval beer. But my guess is I wouldn't like it any better than modern beer.
Well, you should give it a try, nonetheless.
I should.
And so I have to read this because I would mix it up somehow. The prize that we are giving you is for contributing to proliferation of ideas of liberty and free competition, for honoring private property and the rule of law. And once again, the laureate this year is David D. Friedman. Very happy to have you, and we'll be very excited to see you.
I will accept your
again.
virtual prize.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedman.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good year and don't get sick.
You too, thank you. Good day.
Uh-huh.